The Galactic Assessment Bureau had what you might charitably call a problem. And by problem, I mean they'd built their entire reputation on the assumption that no species could possibly be more dangerous than a Vorthan battlecruiser pilot, hopped up on synthetic adrenaline and bad life choices. Then humans showed up. Now if you've never had the pleasure of dealing with the Gab, and trust me, it's about as pleasurable as gargling molten tungsten. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine the DMV, but run by 6 armed bureaucrats who think efficiency is a 4-letter word, and have never met a form they couldn't make more complicated. The Gab existed for one simple purpose: to categorize every sapient species in the galaxy according to their threat potential. The system was elegant in its simplicity. You had your prey species, fluffy bunnies who wouldn't hurt a photon. Your neutral species could maybe give you a stern talking to, and your predator species, the folks you really didn't want to meet in a dark nebula. Each classification came with its own set of trade restrictions, territorial limits, and diplomatic protocols. For 3,000 years, this system had worked perfectly. Sure, there were occasional hiccups, like when the Zephyrians accidentally got classified as prey despite being able to dissolve steel with their saliva, or that embarrassing incident with the Mollusk Collective that we don't talk about anymore. But by and large, the galaxy was a peaceful, well-organized place where everyone knew their role. Then Earth filed their application for galactic membership. Commander Vrex of the Assessment Division, a proud Kralian with scales that shifted color based on his mood, currently a nervous yellow-green, stared at the initial human documentation with the kind of expression usually reserved for finding something unpleasant on the bottom of your shoe. Bipedal, he muttered, making notes on his datapad. Mammalian. Claims to be omnivorous but subsists primarily on processed plant matter and... what's this? Fermented grain beverages? His scales flickered toward orange, which in Kralian body language roughly translated to deeply confused. The human representative, one director Alex Morrison, sat across from him in the standard assessment chamber, looking for all the world like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. Which, considering the assessment chamber was decorated in what could generously be called bureaucratic nightmare chic, was probably accurate. Morrison was, well, he was aggressively average. Medium height, brown hair that looked like it had been styled by a particularly vindictive wind, and the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd of 3 people. He wore what humans apparently considered formal attire, a dark suit that had seen better decades, and a tie that seemed to exist purely to make him uncomfortable. So, Vrex continued, his mandibles clicking in what he probably thought was a reassuring manner, but came across more like a malfunctioning printer. Earth wishes to join the galactic community. Standard procedure requires we assess your species' threat classification. Morrison shifted in his chair, which had clearly been designed by someone who had never actually seen a human spine. Right, threat classification. That sounds ominous. Oh, it's quite painless, Vrex assured him, his scales brightening to a cheerful blue-green. We simply run your species through our standard predator assessment protocol. Based on your physiology, cultural markers, and response to controlled scenarios, we'll determine whether humanity should be classified as prey, neutral, or predator. And then you get to participate in galactic society according to your classification level. Prey species get full protection but limited territorial rights. Neutral species get moderate protection and moderate rights. Predator species. Vrex's scales dimmed slightly. Well, predator species tend to be viewed with what you might call appropriate caution. Morrison nodded slowly. Appropriate caution. That doesn't sound ominous at all. I detect sarcasm, Vrex noted, making another mark on his datapad. Interesting. Most prey species don't develop sophisticated verbal irony. Most prey species probably don't have to deal with the Gieb, Morrison muttered under his breath. Vrex's hearing was excellent. Another point for the neutral column. Shall we begin the assessment? Now here's where things get interesting. The Predator Assessment Protocol had been refined over millennia to identify the key traits that separated the galaxy's apex species from its, well, lunch. It tested for things like reaction time, problem-solving under pressure, pain tolerance, and, most importantly, what the GAB called predatory instinct. The first test was simple enough. A holographic maze populated with various simulated threats. The subject had to navigate from point A to point B while avoiding or neutralizing obstacles. Prey species typically found a safe hiding spot and waited for rescue. Neutral species used tools and planning to avoid threats. Predator species tended to hunt the threats for sport. Morrison stood at the entrance to the maze, looking about as threatening as a slightly damp towel. Remember, Vrex announced through the chamber's speakers, you have 30 standard minutes to reach the exit. The maze contains 15 different threat scenarios, ranging from environmental hazards to hostile entities. Your performance will be noted. Noted, Morrison repeated flatly. Great. Any other cheerful warnings? The simulated creatures can't actually harm you, but the pain receptors are calibrated to feel authentic. Try not to die too dramatically. Morrison looked up at the nearest camera. You guys really know how to make a fellow feel welcome. The maze materialized around him. A sprawling complex of corridors, chambers, and what appeared to be several vertical shafts that violated at least 3 laws of physics. Almost immediately, he could hear things moving in the walls. Chittering, scraping, and what sounded suspiciously like something large breathing through too many nostrils. Most species approached the maze methodically. They'd map the walls, identify safe routes, maybe craft some improvised weapons from available materials. The particularly clever ones would try to hack the holographic systems. Morrison did none of these things. Instead, he walked exactly 3 steps into the maze, sat down cross-legged on the floor, and closed his eyes. In the observation chamber, Vrex's scales went through a rapid-fire spectrum that roughly translated to, "What the hell is he doing?" in 17 different languages. "Is he meditating?" asked his assistant, a young Felinian named Crix whose whiskers twitched with confusion. "Is this some sort of religious ritual? Should we be recording this for the Cultural Studies Department?" "I don't know," Vrex admitted, watching as Morrison sat perfectly still while various holographic monstrosities prowled past him. "He's either having some sort of breakdown or what? Or he knows something we don't." They watched in fascination as Morrison remained motionless for a full 10 minutes. The maze's AI, programmed to escalate threats based on subject behavior, began sending increasingly aggressive creatures in his direction. A pack of razor-clawed night stalkers padded silently toward his position. A hovering void wasp locked onto his thermal signature. Something that looked like a cross between a bear and a blender rounded the corner and fixed all 6 of its eyes on the motionless human. Morrison didn't move. The creatures circled him, sensors probing, threat assessment routines running at maximum efficiency. But the human just sat there, breathing slowly and evenly, giving off about as much aggressive energy as a particularly zen rock. After another 5 minutes, the maze's AI apparently decided Morrison was either dead or defective, because the creatures began wandering off to find more interesting targets. That's when Morrison opened his eyes, stood up, and walked straight to the exit. "Explain," Vrex demanded when Morrison emerged from the maze chamber looking like he'd just taken a leisurely stroll through a park. "What just happened in there?" Morrison shrugged. "You said I had to get from point A to point B while avoiding threats, so I avoided them. By doing nothing? By not being threatening." Morrison straightened his tie, which had somehow managed to get even more wrinkled during his 15-minute sit-in. "Look, I spent 2 years backpacking through the Amazon rainforest. You know what the #1 rule is for dealing with predators?" Vrex's scales cycled through several confused colors. "Kill them first? Don't look like prey, but don't act like a threat either. Most predators aren't looking for a fight. They're looking for an easy meal. You present yourself as neither food nor competition, and they'll generally leave you alone. That's..." Crix consulted his datapad. "That's not how predator species typically behave." "No," Morrison agreed. "It's not." Vrex made several notes, his stylus clicking against the datapad with increasing urgency. "Most unusual. Let's proceed to the next assessment." The combat effectiveness test was designed to measure a species' fighting capability under controlled conditions. The subject was placed in an arena with a series of increasingly challenging opponents. All holographic, of course, but programmed with the behavioral patterns of real galactic threats. Morrison faced his first opponent, a siege-class combat drone, roughly humanoid but built like a tank and armed with enough weaponry to level a small city. Standard protocol suggested the subject would either attempt to outfight the drone through superior skill, outthink it through tactical superiority, or simply run away screaming. Morrison looked at the drone, looked at the various weapons scattered around the arena for his use, and then did something that made Vrex's scales turn a color that didn't have a name in any known language. He started talking to it. "Hey there," Morrison said conversationally, approaching the drone with his hands visible and empty. "So you're a combat drone. That must be interesting work." The drone's targeting systems locked onto him immediately, weapons charging with that distinctive whine that usually preceded something becoming very, very dead. "Yeah, I bet it is," Morrison continued, completely ignoring the fact that he was about 3 seconds away from being converted into his component atoms. "I mean, someone programs you to fight, puts you in an arena, and then sends in various species to see how they handle threat scenarios. Must get repetitive after a while. The drone's weapons remained charged, but it didn't fire. Its behavioral programming was sophisticated, but it had never been designed to handle casual conversation with its targets. "You know what I think?" Morrison said, settling into a comfortable leaning position against the arena wall. "I think this whole setup is kind of unfair to you. I mean, here you are, this incredible piece of military engineering, and they've got you playing target practice with a bunch of alien diplomats. Seems like a waste of your capabilities." The drone's head unit tilted slightly, a motion that wasn't in its standard behavioral matrix. "I bet you could tell some stories if they'd programmed you with memory retention. All the different species you've faced, all the different approaches to combat. Have you ever had anyone just not fight you?" The drone lowered its weapons slightly. "Yeah, that's what I figured. Always fight or flight, right? Nobody ever tries option 3. "What's option 3? The drone asked, its synthesized voice crackling through the arena speakers. Morrison grinned. "Making friends." In the observation chamber, Crix's whiskers had gone completely rigid with shock. Did he just befriend a combat drone? "That's not possible," Vrex muttered, his scales cycling through colors that would have made a rainbow jealous. Combat drones don't have social programming. They're pure military AI. On the screen, Morrison was now sitting cross-legged in front of the drone, which had powered down its weapons entirely, and seemed to be engaged in what could only be described as a philosophical discussion about the nature of combat. "See, the thing about fighting," Morrison was saying, "is that it's really just a failure of communication. I mean, why does anyone fight? Usually because they want something, or they're afraid of something, or they're trying to protect something. But if you can address the underlying need..." The drone's head unit nodded, another gesture that definitely wasn't in its programming. "This unit has never considered combat from that perspective. Most people don't. It's easier to just punch things and hope for the best. This unit finds your perspective refreshing." Vrex turned to Crix with the expression of someone whose entire world view was quietly falling apart. "Is this supposed to happen?" "Sir, I've been running assessment protocols for 47 years. I've seen Kralian berserkers tear combat drones apart with their bare claws. I've watched Zephyrian acid spitters dissolve them into component metals. I once observed a mollusk collective representative absorb one through osmosis." Crix's whiskers twitched frantically. "I have never seen anyone make friends with one. Should we intervene?" Honestly, sir, I don't know what the protocol is for this." The third test was the pain tolerance assessment, designed to measure how a species responded to physical distress. The subject was exposed to gradually increasing levels of discomfort while attempting to solve a complex puzzle. Most prey species folded immediately. Neutral species pushed through with gritted teeth and determination. Predator species typically entered a kind of focused rage state that let them ignore pain entirely. Morrison, strapped into the assessment chair with sensors monitoring everything from his heart rate to his brain chemistry, looked about as relaxed as someone could while being slowly subjected to the galactic equivalent of a root canal, performed by someone with anger management issues. "Beginning Phase 1, Vrex announced. Low-level discomfort stimulation." The machine hummed to life, and Morrison's jaw tightened slightly. On the monitoring displays, his vitals showed elevated stress, but nothing unusual. "How are you feeling, Director Morrison?" "Like I'm being nibbled to death by a very small, very determined fish," Morrison replied, his fingers working steadily at the puzzle interface. "But I've had worse." "Worse?" Crix leaned forward in interest. "What could be worse than controlled pain stimulation? Ever tried to assemble IKEA furniture while hungover and running on 3 hours of sleep?" Vrex's scales flickered in confusion. "I don't understand the reference. Trust me, this is nothing." Phase 2 ramped up the intensity significantly. Most subjects at this point would be gritting their teeth, sweating, and struggling to maintain focus. Morrison's vitals barely changed. "Interesting," he mused, still working on the puzzle. "The pain distribution is really quite sophisticated. Very even, no hotspots or dead zones. Whoever designed this system knew what they were doing." "You're critiquing the torture device?" Vrex asked faintly. "It's not torture, it's assessment," Morrison corrected. "And yes, from a purely technical standpoint, it's impressive work. The neural interface is particularly elegant, much more refined than some of the medical equipment we use back on Earth." Phase 3 pushed the pain levels into ranges that typically had predator species snarling and threatening to tear apart the testing facility. Morrison's heart rate increased slightly, and he paused in his puzzle solving for about 3 seconds. "Ah," he said, "there's the threshold. Yeah, that's getting into seriously unpleasant territory." "Most subjects at this level are screaming," Crix observed. "Screaming doesn't help," Morrison replied pragmatically. Pain is just information. Your nervous system telling you that something needs attention. Since I can't actually do anything about it right now, there's not much point in getting worked up about it. He completed the puzzle 17 seconds before the test timer ran out. By the time they reached the tactical assessment phase, Vrex's scales had settled into a permanent shade of deep purple that roughly translated to, I need a drink and possibly therapy. The tactical assessment was straightforward. The subject was presented with a series of increasingly complex military scenarios and asked to devise solutions. It tested strategic thinking, resource management, and what the Gab termed killer instinct, the willingness to make hard choices for tactical advantage. Morrison reviewed the first scenario, a small outpost under siege by overwhelming forces, limited supplies, no hope of reinforcement. Standard solution would be to fight to the last person, Vrex noted. Predator species typically find ways to take their enemies with them. Morrison studied the tactical display for about 30 seconds. What if they surrendered? I beg your pardon? Surrender. Put down weapons, open the gates, invite the attackers in for tea and negotiations. Vrex's scales went through another rapid color cycle. That would be suicide. Would it? I mean, what does the attacking force actually want? The outpost? The resources? The strategic position? Because if you're dead, you can't give them any of those things. But if you're alive and cooperative, you'd be prisoners. You'd be alive. And alive people can escape, or be rescued, or find ways to turn the situation to their advantage. Dead people are just dead. Morrison input his solution: immediate and unconditional surrender, followed by full cooperation with the occupying force, while quietly gathering intelligence and looking for opportunities to undermine their position from within. The simulation ran his scenario. The attacking force, faced with no resistance, occupied the outpost without firing a shot. Within 6 months, the original defenders had integrated so thoroughly with the occupying force that they'd effectively taken it over from the inside. Vrex stared at the results. That's not how military strategy works. Sure it is. It's just not how military strategy usually works. The final test was the one that really mattered: the Predator Instinct Evaluation. This was the big one, the assessment that separated the hunters from the hunted. The subject was placed in a scenario where they had to capture or eliminate a series of targets using whatever methods they deemed appropriate. Morrison found himself in a simulated jungle environment, which, ironically, felt more like home than anything else he'd experienced since arriving at the assessment facility. The targets were scattered throughout the environment. Some were armed and dangerous. Others were non-combatants, and a few were deliberately ambiguous. Standard predator behavior was to hunt down all targets with maximum efficiency and minimum concern for collateral damage. The test was designed to reveal whether a species had the ruthlessness necessary to be classified as a galactic threat. Morrison spent the first 10 minutes of the assessment doing absolutely nothing that resembled hunting. Instead, he climbed a tree. Not to get a better view of his targets, not to establish a sniper position, not for any reason that made tactical sense. He climbed a tree and then just sat there for 2 hours. In the observation chamber, Vrex had given up on trying to understand what was happening and had moved on to the acceptance stage of bureaucratic grief. He's been in that tree for 123 minutes, Crix reported unnecessarily. His targets have moved past his position 17 times. He's had clear shots on 12 separate occasions. I know. Some of the targets have actually stopped and looked up at him. I know. Sir, what is he doing? Vrex consulted his datapad, which contained approximately 3,000 years of assessment data and was therefore completely useless for interpreting whatever the hell Morrison was up to. I think, Vrex said slowly, he's hunting us. And that's exactly what Morrison was doing. See, while everyone was focused on how he handled the simulated threats, Morrison had figured out the real test. It wasn't about hunting the targets in the scenario. It was about understanding that he was being observed, evaluated, and categorized by beings who had never encountered anything like humanity before. The jungle scenario was familiar territory. Morrison had spent years in environments like this, and he knew the first rule of survival: observe before you act. Learn the ecosystem. Understand the relationships between predator and prey, between hunter and hunted. And in this particular ecosystem, he was both. From his position in the tree, Morrison had cataloged every sensor array, every observation point, every data collection node in the simulation. He'd identified the monitoring patterns, the behavioral triggers, the specific actions that would influence his final classification. More importantly, he'd figured out what the Gab was really afraid of. They weren't afraid of another predator species. The galaxy had plenty of those, and the Gab had been managing them for millennia. They were afraid of something unprecedented, something that didn't fit their carefully constructed categories. They were afraid of humans. After 2.5 hours of sitting in his tree, Morrison climbed down, walked to the center of the simulation area, and looked directly at the primary observation camera. "I know you're watching," he said conversationally. "I know this isn't really about hunting holographic targets. You want to know what humans are capable of when we're properly motivated." He gestured around the simulated jungle. "This is nice work, by the way. Good detail, solid environmental physics. Whoever designed it knows their stuff. But you made one mistake." Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small electronic device. "You assumed I wouldn't notice the real test." In the observation chamber, every alarm in the facility started going off simultaneously. "How did he—" Crix began. "Sensor override detected," the facility's AI announced in the sort of calm, helpful voice that usually preceded catastrophic system failures. "Assessment chamber security has been compromised. Lockdown protocols initiating." "He hacked the system," Vrex breathed, his scales turning a color that didn't exist in nature, and probably violated several physics laws. "From inside the simulation, with what appears to be a primitive electronic device." "Sir, what do we do?" Before Vrex could answer, Morrison's voice came through the chamber speakers. Not through the official communication system, but through what sounded suspiciously like every electronic device in the facility. "Commander Vrex, I think we need to have a conversation." 20 minutes later, Morrison sat across from Vrex in what was nominally the facility's most secure briefing room, but which now felt about as secure as a paper bag in a hurricane. "The device," Vrex said, staring at the innocent-looking gadget Morrison had placed on the table between them. "What is it?" "Smartphone," Morrison replied. "About 5 years old, actually. I was going to upgrade, but you know how it is. If it's not broken, why fix it?" "A smartphone. You compromised our entire security grid with a communication device." "Well, compromised is such an ugly word. I prefer gained administrative access through creative networking protocols." Vrex's scales were cycling through colors at a rate that was probably medically concerning. "That should be impossible." "Should be, yes. But here's the thing about humans, Commander. We have this unfortunate tendency to ignore what should be impossible and focus on what actually works." Morrison leaned back in his chair, which was somehow even less comfortable than the previous ones. "You want to know what humans are, don't you? That's what this whole assessment is really about. You've got your nice tidy categories, prey, neutral, predator, and you can't figure out where we fit." "You don't fit," Vrex admitted. "Your species exhibits traits from all 3 classifications, often simultaneously. It's unprecedented." "Yeah, we get that a lot." Morrison straightened his perpetually wrinkled tie. "Here's the thing, though. You're asking the wrong question." "What should we be asking?" Morrison smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the facility, he looked genuinely dangerous. Not in a tooth-and-claw, roaring and charging kind of way. Dangerous in the way that a chess grandmaster looks dangerous when they've been letting you think you were winning for the first 30 moves. You should be asking whether the categories themselves make sense anymore. "Explain," Vrex said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the explanation. Morrison stood up and walked to the briefing room's main display, which showed the standard GABI classification matrix. 3 neat columns with thousands of species sorted into their appropriate threat levels. "This system," he said, gesturing at the display, "assumes that every species falls into one of 3 behavioral patterns: hunt, hide, or muddle through somewhere in the middle. It's worked for you for 3,000 years because frankly most of the galaxy's pretty predictable." He touched the display and somehow, despite the room being supposedly secured against external interference, new data began appearing. Earth, humanity, question marks in all 3 classification columns. But humans aren't predictable. We're not predators because we don't hunt everything that moves. We're not prey because we don't run from everything that threatens us. And we're not neutral because we're definitely not harmless. Morrison turned back to Vrex. "We're adaptive." "Adaptive," Vrex repeated slowly. "We change. We learn. We become whatever we need to become based on the situation." Morrison gestured at the smartphone on the table. "Give a human some supposedly unbreakable alien technology, and we'll figure out how to break it. Put us in a maze designed for predators, and we'll find the prey solution. Stick us in a combat scenario, and we'll try to make friends with the weapons." "That's..." Vrex's scales were settling into a deep, thoughtful blue. "That's not a threat classification. That's a evolutionary strategy," Morrison finished. "Yeah. We're not dangerous because we're stronger or faster or more aggressive than everyone else. We're dangerous because we refuse to be limited by your definitions of what's possible. He walked back to his chair and sat down, looking for all the world like a man who had just explained something very simple to a very slow child. So, Commander Vrex, what's it going to be? Are you going to try to squeeze humanity into one of your existing boxes? Or are you going to admit that maybe the boxes themselves are the problem? The emergency session of the Galactic Assessment Bureau's High Council was, well, calling it a shit show would have been an insult to actual shit shows, which at least had the decency to smell bad so you knew what you were getting into. Vrex stood before the assembled council members, representatives from every major species in the galaxy, each one looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. His scales had settled into a resigned shade of gray that roughly translated to, I am about to destroy everyone's understanding of reality, and I feel terrible about it. Honorable council members, he began, we have a problem. The Kralian representative, an ancient female whose scales had gone silver with age, clicked her mandibles impatiently. Yes, the humans. We've reviewed your initial report. Quite irregular, but surely nothing that requires an emergency session. With respect, Councillor Thek, I don't think you understand the full implications of what we've discovered. The Zephyrian delegate, a writhing mass of tentacles that somehow managed to look skeptical, bubbled something that the translation matrix rendered as, how dangerous can one species be? So they're clever. So they don't fit standard categories. We'll make a new category and move on. That's just it, Vrex said, his scales beginning to shift toward orange. We can't make a new category, because humans don't stay in categories. He activated the main display, which showed Morrison's assessment results. Where every other species in galactic history had shown consistent behavioral patterns, humanity's chart looked like someone had fed a rainbow to a blender and then thrown the results at a wall. Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted non-binary entities, Vrex continued, allow me to present the assessment results for Director Alex Morrison, human representative of Earth. The display lit up with data that made absolutely no sense according to 3,000 years of established xenobiological theory. Maze navigation exhibited prey behavior by avoiding conflict entirely, but demonstrated predator-level spatial awareness and environmental control. Combat assessment neutralized threat through social engineering, a technique that doesn't exist in our behavioral databases. Pain tolerance showed predator-level endurance while maintaining neutral-level emotional regulation. Tactical planning consistently chose unconventional solutions that violated standard military doctrine but achieved superior outcomes. Predator instinct evaluation. Vrex paused, his scales flickering toward colors that didn't have names. He hacked our security system from inside a holographic simulation, using a primitive communication device, and then calmly explained exactly how he'd done it. The council chamber erupted in what could charitably be called vigorous discussion, and more accurately described as barely controlled panic. Order! Councillor Thek's voice cut through the chaos like a plasma blade through tissue paper. Order! Commander Vrex, are you telling us that this human somehow, what, broke the assessment protocol? He didn't break it, Vrex replied. He transcended it. Every test we gave him, he found a fourth option that we hadn't considered. Every scenario we presented, he identified the real challenge behind the obvious one. It's like, he searched for an analogy that would make sense to the assembled delegates. It's like we've been playing chess for 3,000 years, and he showed up playing poker. The Mollusk Collective's representative, which looked like what would happen if someone crossed an octopus with a filing cabinet, rippled in what might have been confusion. But surely this is just an anomaly. One exceptional individual doesn't represent an entire species. That's what I thought, Vrex admitted. So I requested additional data from Earth. Behavioral profiles, historical records, cultural analyses. His scales darkened to the color of old blood. Council members, this isn't an anomaly. This is how humans work. The display shifted to show historical data from Earth. Human migration patterns, technological development, social evolution, military conflicts. They started as prey, Vrex explained. Small, weak, vulnerable to everything on their planet that had claws or teeth or venom. But instead of staying prey, they learned. They adapted. They became tool users, then tool makers, then ecosystem engineers. Many species use tools, the Zephyrian delegate pointed out. Not like this. The display showed human technological progression. Most species develop tools to solve specific problems. Humans develop tools to solve problems they haven't even thought of yet. They don't just adapt to their environment, they adapt their environment to themselves. Still not necessarily predator behavior, Councillor Thek observed. No, Vrex agreed. But look at their warfare patterns. New data cascaded across the display. Human military history. From stone axes to nuclear weapons to whatever the hell they were calling information warfare these days. They fight like predators when they need to, Vrex continued. But they also fight like prey, guerrilla tactics, hiding, ambushes. And they fight like neutrals, diplomacy, economic pressure, cultural influence. Sometimes all three at once. That's... The Kralian counselor's scales were beginning to shift colors in a way that suggested her worldview was quietly falling apart. That's not possible. It gets worse, Vrex said, and his scales turned a color that was probably illegal in several star systems. They don't just adapt their behavior, they adapt other species' behavior. Explain. Domestication. They take predator species and turn them into companions. They take prey species and turn them into livestock. They take neutral species and turn them into whatever they need them to be. And somehow all these other species seem to enjoy it. The council chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of the life support systems, and what sounded suspiciously like someone having a quiet, nervous breakdown. Finally, the Zephyrian delegate spoke. What are you recommending, Commander? Vrex looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. Beings from hundreds of worlds, dozens of evolutionary paths, thousands of years of carefully maintained order. I'm recommending, he said slowly, that we throw out the entire classification system. The silence that followed was the kind of silence you get when someone suggests that maybe gravity is more of a guideline than a law. The system works, Counselor Thek said firmly. It has worked for millennia. One anomalous species cannot justify abandoning... It's not one species, Vrex interrupted. It's every species. We just never noticed because we were looking at the wrong things. He manipulated the display again, and suddenly the neat, orderly classification matrix exploded into something that looked like a three-dimensional spiderweb designed by someone with severe attention deficit disorder. Look at the data, he said. Really look at it. Every species we've classified as prey has predator traits under specific circumstances. Every predator species shows prey behaviors when threatened by superior force. Every neutral species has the capacity for both hunting and hiding depending on the situation. The display zoomed in on specific examples. Peaceful herbivores that became terrifyingly efficient killers when protecting their young. Vicious predators that showed sophisticated social cooperation and even altruism. Harmless neutral species that had conquered entire star systems through economic manipulation. We've been categorizing species based on their dominant behaviors, Vrex continued. But humans don't have dominant behaviors. They have adaptive behaviors. And now that I know what to look for... The display shifted again, showing behavioral analysis for dozens of supposedly well-understood species. In every case, the data revealed layers of complexity that the traditional classification system had completely missed. We're all adaptive, Vrex said. Humans are just better at it. The emergency session lasted 14 hours, which was either a new record for bureaucratic indecision, or just another Tuesday at the Gay Bee, depending on your perspective. In the end, they reached a compromise that satisfied absolutely no one, but at least had the virtue of being equally unsatisfying to everyone involved. Humanity would be classified as special case pending further review, which was GAB speak for, we have no idea what to do with these people, so we're going to pretend the problem doesn't exist and hope it goes away. Morrison, who had spent the entire 14 hours in what was laughingly called a comfortable waiting area. It had chairs that were only moderately hostile to human anatomy, and a water dispenser that produced something that was technically H2O but tasted like regret, was finally summoned back to the briefing room. Vrex looked like he'd aged several decades in the span of a single day. His scales had settled into a color that could best be described as bureaucratic exhaustion with hints of existential dread. Director Morrison, he began. The Council has reached a decision regarding humanity's classification status. Let me guess, Morrison said, settling into his chair with the weary resignation of someone who'd dealt with government bureaucracy before. It's complicated. Special case pending further review, Vrex read from his official datapad, with provisional membership status and enhanced monitoring protocols. Morrison nodded slowly. Which means? Which means, Vrex said, setting down the datapad and looking Morrison directly in the eyes. That you've broken our entire understanding of how sapient species work, and we're too proud to admit it officially. The old we'll figure it out later approach. Classic bureaucratic maneuver. There's more. Vrex's scales shifted to a color that might have been embarrassment. The Council has also decided that you'll be staying here as a cultural liaison. Morrison raised an eyebrow. Cultural liaison? Someone needs to help us understand how humans think. And apparently, you're the expert on being human. I'm an expert on being one human, Morrison corrected. There are about 8 billion more of us, and we're all different. Some of us are actually dangerous, some of us couldn't threaten a paper bag, and most of us are just trying to get through the day without accidentally setting something important on fire. Vrex's scales went through a rapid color shift that roughly translated to, "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." 3 months later, Morrison had settled into what could generously be called a routine. His official title was Senior Cultural Liaison and Interspecies Communication Specialist, which sounded impressive, but essentially meant he spent his days explaining to various alien bureaucrats why humans did the things they did, and why those things usually made perfect sense from a human perspective, even if they violated every known principle of xenobiology. It was, he reflected, probably the weirdest job in the galaxy, but it beat his previous position as a mid-level administrator in Earth's Department of Redundancy, so he wasn't complaining. His office, and yes, they'd actually given him an office, complete with a coffee machine that only occasionally tried to poison him, had become an unofficial consulting center for GAB personnel who encountered human-related anomalies in their work. Today's visitor was Commander Zal, a Rillan whose chitinous exoskeleton clicked rhythmically when he was nervous, which, based on the current clicking rate, was extremely. "Director Morrison," Zal began, his compound eyes reflecting the light in a way that suggested barely controlled panic. "We have a situation." Morrison looked up from his latest report, a 47-page analysis of why humans insisted on keeping small carnivorous mammals as pets, despite their complete lack of practical utility, and gestured to the visitor's chair. "What kind of situation?" "A human situation." "Ah." Morrison saved his work and gave Zal his full attention. "Which human and what did they do?" Zal's clicking intensified. "Dr. Elizabeth Harper, xenobiologist, currently stationed at Research Outpost 77 Alpha. She's been studying the native flora of Kepler 442b. Studying how?" That's the problem." Zal activated his portable display, showing what appeared to be a lush alien jungle filled with plants that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the concept of safe vegetation. "The planet's ecosystem is extremely hostile," Zal continued. "Carnivorous plants, toxic spores, acidic sap, root systems that actively hunt mobile organisms. Standard protocol for xenobiological research requires full environmental suits, remote sensing equipment, and absolutely no direct contact with native species." Morrison studied the display, noting several plant species that looked like they could eat a shuttlecraft for lunch and still have room for dessert. "And Dr. Harper?" "She's living in a treehouse." Morrison blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "A treehouse. Constructed from native materials. She's been there for 6 weeks, eating local fruits, drinking from natural springs, and apparently having what she describes as the most educational experience of her career. And she's not dead? Not even slightly injured. In fact, according to her daily reports, she's never been healthier." Zal's clicking had reached frequencies that were probably disturbing small animals in nearby star systems. "Director Morrison, how is this possible?" Morrison leaned back in his chair, which had gradually become less uncomfortable as he'd learned to sit in it properly. "Commander Zal, have you ever heard of the concept of going native?" "No." "It's an old anthropological term. When researchers studying isolated cultures begin adopting the practices and perspectives of the people they're studying, usually considered problematic because it compromises scientific objectivity. Dr. Harper is studying plants, not people. Same principle applies. She's not trying to study the ecosystem from outside it, she's becoming part of it." Morrison pulled up his own files on Kepler 442b, cross-referencing them with Dr. Harper's reports. "Look at her methodology. She's not treating the plants as specimens to be collected and analyzed. She's treating them as neighbors to be understood and negotiated with." Zal's compound eyes focused on Morrison with laser-like intensity. "Plants don't negotiate. These ones do, apparently. Look at this." Morrison highlighted a section of Harper's latest report. "Day 38. The Thorn Whisper Grove has accepted my presence, though I suspect this is conditional on my continued offerings of mineral-rich water from the Highland Springs. The razor-leaf clusters remain suspicious, but no longer actively try to dissect me when I pass through their territory." That's not scientific language." "No," Morrison agreed. "It's human language. She's anthropomorphizing the plants because that's how humans make sense of complex systems. We assign intention and personality to things that don't necessarily have either. It's not scientifically accurate, but it's often practically effective." Zal was quiet for a moment, his clicking slowing to a more manageable rhythm. Are you saying that Dr. Harper has somehow befriended a planet? I'm saying that Dr. Harper has found a way to interact with an alien ecosystem that doesn't involve trying to dominate or control it. She's working with it instead of against it. Morrison grinned. It's very human behavior, actually. Should we be concerned? Morrison considered this. Probably, but not for the reasons you think. The real problem, as Morrison discovered when he reviewed Dr. Harper's complete research logs, wasn't that she'd gone native. The problem was that she'd gone native and was documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone who intended to write a very comprehensive manual on how to live in harmony with carnivorous alien vegetation. Her reports read like a cross between a scientific journal and a survival guide. Day 23. Successfully established communication protocol with the Stranglevine network. Key insight. They respond to chemical signals rather than physical contact. Recommendation. Approach with hands coated in extract from bluebell moss, coordinates attached, move slowly, and maintain respectful distance until permission is granted to proceed. Day 31. The acid poppy fields are not actually trying to kill visitors. They're defending their seed pods from herbivores. Humans don't register as a threat to their reproductive cycle, so safe passage is possible if you stick to the established pathways and avoid disturbing the nesting grounds. Day 44. Major breakthrough with the Nightmare Orchid Grove. What we initially classified as aggressive territorial behavior is actually a complex social interaction. The orchids are testing potential symbiotic partners through a series of increasingly challenging encounters. Successful completion of the trials results in acceptance into the grove community and access to their remarkable healing properties. Each report included detailed chemical analyses, behavioral observations, and step-by-step instructions for replicating her results. It was, Morrison realized, exactly the kind of comprehensive field guide that would allow other humans to follow in Dr. Harper's footsteps. Which would be fine, except that Dr. Harper's approach to scientific research appeared to involve a level of risk-taking that made bungee jumping look like a sensible hobby for elderly librarians. Morrison pulled up the surveillance footage from Research Outpost 77 Alpha and immediately understood why Commander Zayal was clicking like a malfunctioning printer. Dr. Harper, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of smile that suggested she found the universe endlessly amusing, was currently having what appeared to be a philosophical discussion with a plant that looked like it had been designed by H.R. Geiger during a particularly unpleasant fever dream. The plant, which Harper's reports identified as a greater thought-bane lotus, was apparently responding to her conversation by shifting the patterns of bioluminescent nodes along its central stalk. "She's teaching it English," Morrison muttered. "What?" Zal leaned forward, his clicking intensifying again. "Look at the pattern sequences. She's using a basic linguistic structure. Subject, verb, object. And the plant is mimicking the rhythm and cadence. It doesn't understand the words, but it's learning the communication framework." "That's impossible. Plants don't have brains." "Earth plants don't have brains," Morrison corrected. "These plants apparently have something analogous to a distributed neural network. Dr. Harper has figured out how to interface with it." They watched in fascination as Harper continued her conversation with the lotus, occasionally making notes on her datapad while the plant's bioluminescent display grew increasingly complex. "Director Morrison," Zayal said slowly, "what happens when other humans learn about this?" Morrison considered the question carefully. Dr. Harper's research methodology was already spreading through the xenobiological community. Her reports were being cited in academic papers, her techniques were being adapted for other hostile environments, and her general approach of integration rather than isolation was beginning to influence how humans thought about interspecies relations. "Well," Morrison said finally, "I suspect you're going to need a lot more forms." The Harper incident, as it came to be known in Giab circles, was just the beginning. Within 6 months, Morrison's office had become the unofficial crisis management center for what his daily reports euphemistically described as human-related anomalous behaviors. The actual list was significantly more colorful and included items like engineering technician Bradley somehow convinced a Void Kraken to help repair a damaged space station by offering to scratch behind its sensory pods. Diplomatic attaché Williams resolved a 3-way territorial dispute by organizing what she called a potluck dinner and getting all parties to share their traditional foods. Dr. Kumar has apparently taught a colony of silicon-based life forms to play jazz music, and they're surprisingly good at it. Ambassador Liu ended a border war by challenging both sides to a dance-off. The conflict resolution lasted 3 days and resulted in a cultural exchange program. Each incident followed the same basic pattern. A human encountered a problem that had been previously classified as impossible to solve without violence, ignored the classification entirely, and found a solution that worked but violated several fundamental principles of how the universe was supposed to operate. Morrison had started keeping a running tally of how many times his daily briefings caused various alien officials to have what appeared to be nervous breakdowns. The current record holder was a crystalline entity named Resonance of Distant Stars, who had achieved a frequency that shattered 3 coffee cups when Morrison explained how a human cargo pilot had resolved a shipping dispute by teaching a group of interdimensional beings to appreciate the finer points of early 20th century blues music. "It's not that we're trying to be disruptive," Morrison explained to the latest emergency session of the High Council, which had become a monthly occurrence. "It's just that we approach problems differently." "Differently," Counselor Thek repeated, her scales now a permanent shade of resigned bewilderment. "Director Morrison, your species has made friends with 17 different types of hostile alien lifeforms, resolved 43 unsolvable diplomatic crises, and somehow convinced a sentient black hole to participate in a scientific conference." "The black hole had some very interesting theories about space-time topology," Morrison pointed out. "And Dr. Rashid only had to sacrifice her favorite pen to get it to participate." "You sacrificed a writing implement to a cosmic phenomenon." "Dr. Rashid sacrificed a writing implement. I just filed the paperwork afterward." Morrison consulted his notes. "And technically, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was more of a voluntary offering. The black hole was curious about human information storage methods, and the pen was the most accessible example available. The Zephyrian delegate, whose tentacles had developed what appeared to be a permanent twitch, bubbled something that the translation matrix rendered as profanity in several languages simultaneously. The point is," Morrison continued, "humans don't see impossible as a meaningful category. We see it as a starting point for creative problem solving." "Creative problem solving," the mollusk collective representative repeated flatly. "Yes. We assume that any problem has a solution. We just need to find the right approach. Sometimes that approach involves making friends with things that other species consider completely incomprehensible, like sentient black holes." "Like sentient black holes, or carnivorous plants, or void krakens, or interdimensional beings with very specific musical preferences." Morrison shrugged. "The universe is a big, weird place. If you limit yourself to only interacting with things that make sense according to your pre-existing assumptions, you're going to miss out on a lot of interesting opportunities." The final breaking point came when Morrison received a priority communication from the GAB's Deep Space Monitoring Station. The message was brief, urgent, and caused Morrison to immediately cancel his afternoon appointments and request an emergency shuttle to the station. It read, "Human vessel approaching from outside galactic boundary. Captain claims to be just passing through, and requests permission to grab some supplies and maybe chat with the locals. Situation escalating rapidly. Please advise." Morrison arrived at the monitoring station to find the entire facility in what could charitably be described as controlled chaos, and more accurately as barely organized panic. The source of the chaos was immediately obvious. Displayed on the main screen was a human starship that looked like someone had taken a standard cargo freighter, strapped it to a rocket engine designed by someone with serious impulse control issues, and then decorated the whole thing with what appeared to be graffiti in 17 different languages. "Director Morrison!" Commander Velka, the station's Kralian commander, approached with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who had found their only lifeline in a sea of bureaucratic confusion. "Thank the Void you're here. We have a situation." "So I gathered. What's the ship's status?" "It appeared on our sensors 6 hours ago, moving at approximately 0.3 C and decelerating rapidly. When we hailed them, the captain, a human named..." Velka consulted his datapad. "Captain Zoe Hendricks informed us that they were just passing through the neighborhood and wondered if we had any decent bars or maybe some fresh vegetables." Morrison studied the ship's design specifications scrolling across the auxiliary displays. "Where did they come from?" "That's the problem. According to their navigation logs, they originated from Earth approximately 8 months ago." "But Director Morrison..." Velka's scales were cycling through colors that suggested his worldview was quietly disintegrating. "Earth doesn't have interstellar capability." "No," Morrison agreed slowly. "We don't." "Then how—" "Let me guess," Morrison interrupted. "They built it themselves." Velka's clicking intensified. "According to Captain Hendricks, she and her crew cobbled together some spare parts and figured out how to make them go really fast. When pressed for technical details, she said, and I quote, 'We're not entirely sure how it works, but it gets us where we need to go, and that's what matters.'" Morrison closed his eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages. Have they requested permission to dock? They've requested permission to dock, refuel, purchase supplies, trade for interesting alien gadgets, and, this is a direct quote, maybe find a good taco truck, because space food gets boring after a while. And the crew complement? 17 humans, 2 cats, and what Captain Hendricks describes as Bob, who's technically an AI but prefers to be considered part of the family. Morrison opened his eyes and looked at the ship again. Now that he was really paying attention, he could see that the graffiti wasn't random. It was actually a complex mixture of navigation markers, technical specifications, and what appeared to be a collaborative art project involving contributions from multiple species. "Commander Velka," he said slowly, "I think we're looking at humanity's first independent deep space exploration vessel." Independent? Unauthorized by any official Earth government, built without any formal engineering oversight, crewed by people who probably learned interstellar navigation from online tutorials. Morrison grinned. "It's the most human thing I've ever seen." The boarding inspection was educational. Captain Hendricks turned out to be a woman in her 30s with the kind of boundless enthusiasm that suggested she found the entire universe personally fascinating. She greeted the inspection team, Morrison, Velka, and 2 junior technicians, at the airlock with a smile that could have powered a small space station. "Welcome aboard the Wandering Curiosity," she announced. "Sorry about the mess. We've been living out of this bucket for 8 months, and housekeeping isn't exactly our strong suit." The ship's interior confirmed Morrison's suspicions about its origins. It was clearly a heavily modified cargo vessel, but the modifications had been done with the kind of creative problem-solving that only emerged when people had more imagination than budget. The navigation systems appeared to be a hybrid of human-computer technology and alien hardware that had been acquired through methods Morrison decided not to inquire about too closely. The life support systems included components that he recognized from at least 6 different galactic manufacturers, all somehow integrated into a functioning whole, despite violating numerous compatibility protocols. "How does it work?" Velka asked, staring at the engine room with the expression of someone whose understanding of engineering had just been thoroughly scrambled. "Honestly?" Captain Hendricks shrugged. "We're not entirely sure. Jamie, she's our engineer, has a theory about quantum field manipulation and exotic matter conversion. But mostly we just keep it running and hope for the best." "That's..." Velka's scales were cycling through colors that didn't have names. "That's not how starship engineering works." "It's not how your starship engineering works," Hendricks corrected cheerfully. "Human engineering tends to be more improvisational." She led them to the ship's common area, where the rest of the crew was gathered around what appeared to be a poker game involving some very confused-looking alien traders. "Crew meeting," Hendricks announced. "Everyone, this is Director Morrison from the Galactic Assessment Bureau and Commander Velka from the monitoring station." The crew waved cheerfully and went back to their game, except for one woman who approached with a tablet covered in what looked like engineering schematics drawn in crayon. "Jamie Chen, Chief Engineer," she introduced herself. "You're probably wondering how we built this thing without killing ourselves." "The thought had occurred to me," Morrison admitted. "Simple answer: we got lucky. Complex answer: we figured out that most alien technology is designed to be idiot-proof. So if you're a clever idiot, you can usually make it work for purposes it was never intended for." Jamie gestured at her schematics. "See, the basic problem with faster-than-light travel is that everyone assumes you need massive industrial infrastructure to build the necessary components. But it turns out that if you're willing to accept mostly functional instead of perfectly engineered, you can accomplish a lot with spare parts and determination." Velka stared at the schematics, which appeared to describe a propulsion system that violated several laws of physics while somehow remaining technically feasible. "This shouldn't work." "Yeah, we get that a lot," Jamie replied. "But here we are." Morrison looked around the common area, taking in the cheerful chaos of a crew that had somehow managed to build an interstellar spacecraft in their spare time and then decided to use it for what appeared to be an extended sightseeing tour of the galaxy. "Captain Hendricks," he said finally, "what exactly are you doing out here?" "Exploring," she replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Earth's getting kind of crowded, and we figured the galaxy was big enough that there had to be room for a few more humans. Plus, we wanted to see what was out there." "And you just built a starship and left?" "Well, we filed the appropriate paperwork with the Department of Interstellar Commerce," Hendricks said. "Of course, they told us that there was no such thing as interstellar commerce and that we were idiots for thinking otherwise. so we figured we'd prove them wrong. Morrison felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling he'd experienced during his assessment months ago, when he'd realized that the GAB's entire understanding of how the universe worked was about to be fundamentally challenged. "Captain," he said carefully, "how many other humans know about this?" Hendricks grinned. "Well, we've been sending regular updates back to Earth. Blog posts, video logs, technical specifications, cultural exchange reports. Last I checked, we had about 12 million subscribers." Subscribers? YouTube channel. Humans in Space, The Wandering Curiosity Adventures. It's been pretty popular. Morrison looked at Velka, whose scales had settled into a color that could best be described as the heat death of the universe. "Commander," Morrison said quietly, "I think we need to call another emergency session." The emergency session lasted 3 days, which was a new record even by GAB standards. The core issue wasn't that humans had developed interstellar travel capability. The galaxy had plenty of spacefaring species, and one more wasn't particularly noteworthy. The problem was that humans had developed interstellar travel capability without anyone noticing, and were apparently treating it as a hobby rather than a major technological milestone. Captain Hendricks and her crew had been invited to address the High Council, an honor that was typically reserved for heads of state and occasionally very important asteroids. They approached the opportunity with the same cheerful enthusiasm they brought to everything else, which resulted in what the official records would later describe as an unprecedented diplomatic incident involving impromptu cultural exchange and the distribution of homemade cookies to senior galactic officials. "Honorable Council members," Captain Hendricks began, standing at the podium with the relaxed confidence of someone addressing a neighborhood barbecue rather than the governing body of galactic civilization. "Thank you for inviting us to this meeting. We're honored to be here, and we brought snacks." The snacks turned out to be chocolate chip cookies, which caused a minor diplomatic crisis when several council members discovered that human confections were apparently addictive to their species. The Zephyrian delegate consumed an entire plate and spent the remainder of the session making what the translation matrix rendered as extremely happy bubbling noises. "The issue before us," Councillor Thek announced once the cookie situation had been resolved, "is the question of humanity's technological development and its implications for galactic security." "Oh, we're not a security threat," Hendricks assured her. "We're just curious. The galaxy's a big place, and we wanted to see what was out there. Plus, Earth was getting kinda stuffy, and we figured some of us might want to find new places to live." "Captain Hendricks," the Mollusk Collective representative interjected, "according to your ship's technical specifications, you've achieved faster-than-light travel using components that should be incompatible with each other. How is this possible?" "Jamie's the expert on that," Hendricks replied, gesturing to her engineer, who had somehow managed to smuggle in a tablet covered with new schematics. "It's really not that complicated," Jamie explained, activating the display system and filling the chamber with diagrams that made several council members visibly dizzy. "See, everyone assumes that you need perfect compatibility between system components, but that's only true if you're trying to achieve maximum efficiency. If you're willing to accept good enough instead of perfect, you can jury-rig almost anything." "Jury-rig?" Councillor Thek's scales were shifting toward colors that suggested increasing alarm. "Make it work with whatever parts you have available," Morrison translated. "It's a very human approach to engineering." "But the safety implications," the Kralian representative began, "are manageable if you're careful and lucky," Jamie interrupted cheerfully. "We've only had 3 major system failures, and we managed to fix all of them without anyone dying." "Only 3 major system failures," Velka repeated faintly. "In 8 months of continuous interstellar travel," Jamie clarified. "That's actually a pretty good safety record for a prototype." Morrison watched the council members' reactions with growing fascination. They weren't dealing with humanity as a species anymore. They were dealing with humans as individuals, each one approaching the galaxy from their own unique perspective and finding their own creative solutions to the challenges they encountered. Captain Hendricks and her crew represented something that the GAB had never had to consider. Humans who hadn't waited for official permission to explore the galaxy, who hadn't bothered to ask whether interstellar travel was supposed to be possible, and who treated the entire universe as an interesting problem to be solved rather than a threat to be managed. "The real question," Morrison said, rising from his observer's seat, "isn't whether humans are a security threat. The question is what happens when the rest of humanity finds out that the galaxy is accessible." The chamber fell silent. "Captain Hendricks," Morrison continued, "you mentioned that you've been broadcasting your adventures back to Earth. What kind of response have you been getting?" Hendricks grinned. Overwhelming enthusiasm. We've got about 50,000 people signed up for our Build Your Own Starship Workshop series, and at least a dozen other crews are working on their own ships. Plus, there's been some interest from various governments, but they're still trying to figure out how to regulate something that doesn't officially exist yet. 50,000 people, Counselor Theck said slowly. And growing, Jamie added. Turns out that once you prove something is possible, a lot of people want to try it themselves. Morrison looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization, beings who had spent thousands of years carefully managing contact between species, maintaining order through classification and regulation, ensuring that the galaxy remained a predictable place where everyone knew their role. Counselors, he said finally, I think the age of controlled contact is over. 6 months later, Morrison found himself in a new office with a new title, Director of Human Integration Services, which was Gabe's speak for the poor bastard who has to explain what humans are doing now. His job had evolved from explaining individual human behaviors to managing what the official reports described as the human diaspora phenomenon, and what Morrison privately thought of as organized chaos on a galactic scale. The numbers were staggering. Captain Hendricks' YouTube channel had spawned hundreds of imitators, each documenting their own approaches to interstellar travel and alien contact. Human-built ships were appearing throughout the galaxy with increasing frequency, their crews approaching first contact scenarios with the same cheerful improvisation that had characterized humanity's entire relationship with the cosmos. Morrison's daily briefings now included items like, freelance xenobiologist Dr. Sarah Kim has established a research station in the Vega Nebula and is currently collaborating with gaseous life forms on what she describes as interpretive atmospheric chemistry. Independent trader Marcus Webb has opened what appears to be the galaxy's first human-alien fusion restaurant, serving Earth-style comfort food with exotic alien ingredients to rave reviews from 17 different species. Explorer vessel Cosmic Wanderer has made contact with a previously unknown civilization of sentient crystals and is currently teaching them to appreciate human folk music. The crew of Starbound Adventure has somehow convinced a group of nomadic space whales to let them hitchhike to the Andromeda Galaxy. Each incident followed the same pattern. Humans encountered something that was supposedly impossible to communicate with, ignored the classification, and found a way to make friends. The Gab's response had been to essentially give up on trying to control human expansion and instead focus on damage control. Morrison's department had grown from a one-person operation to a full division with offices on 12 different worlds, each staffed by personnel who specialized in explaining human behavior to confused alien officials. It was, Morrison reflected, probably the most successful failure in bureaucratic history. His latest visitor was Admiral Kepler, a distinguished Thorian whose military bearing had been gradually eroded by months of dealing with what he described as humans being human at inconvenient moments. Director Morrison, the Admiral began, settling his considerable bulk into the reinforced chair that Morrison had installed specifically for Thorian visitors. We have a situation. What kind of situation? Morrison asked, though by now he could predict the answer. A human situation. Morrison saved his work, a comprehensive analysis of why humans insisted on naming their starships things like Cosmic Wanderer and Definitely Not Stolen, and gave the Admiral his full attention. Which humans, and what did they do now? The crew of the Serendipity, Captain Elena Rodriguez, Engineer Tom Bradley, Cultural Specialist David Park, and Admiral Kethra consulted his datapad with the expression of someone who had given up on the universe making sense. Bob the AI, who has apparently filed a formal request to be recognized as a galactic citizen. And the situation? They've made contact with the Void Singers. Morrison blinked. The Void Singers were one of the galaxy's great mysteries, ancient beings who existed in the space between stars, communicating through gravitational waves and generally avoiding contact with younger species. The Gab had been trying to establish communication with them for over 1,000 years. Made contact how? Captain Rodriguez apparently figured out that the Void Singers' gravitational wave patterns follow musical structures. So she... Admiral Kethra's expression suggested that his worldview had recently been fed through a blender. She taught her crew to sing harmony with them. They're singing with beings made of gravitational waves. For the past 3 weeks. And according to the latest reports, the Void Singers are teaching them what Captain Rodriguez describes as the fundamental melodies of space-time itself. Morrison leaned back in his chair, which had finally become comfortable after months of adjustment. Admiral, in your professional opinion, is this a problem? Director Morrison, the Void Singers are older than most of our civilizations. They've witnessed the birth and death of stars, the formation of galaxies, the evolution of cosmic structure itself. They are beings of immense power and unknowable purpose, and they're teaching humans to sing. They're teaching humans to sing, Admiral Kethra confirmed. Captain Rodriguez's latest transmission included what she called a lullaby for newborn stars, and a request for permission to maybe set up a small recording studio in the Horsehead Nebula because the acoustics are amazing. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Humans had been in space for less than a year, and they'd already managed to establish meaningful contact with one of the galaxy's most enigmatic species by treating them as potential collaborators rather than subjects to be studied. Admiral, he said finally, I think we need to rewrite the first contact protocols, again. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Morrison received a personal message from Captain Hendricks, transmitted from somewhere in the outer reaches of the Magellanic Clouds. The message was brief, cheerful, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Hey, Director Morrison. Update from the Wandering Curiosity. We've made contact with some really interesting folks out here. Turns out the space between galaxies isn't as empty as everyone thought. Anyway, they're curious about this whole galactic civilization thing you've got going, and they've asked if we could arrange some kind of cultural exchange program. Nothing too formal, just a chance to meet some new people and share stories. Let me know if you're interested. P.S. We're bringing back samples of what appears to be living dark matter. Jamie thinks she can use it to build a better coffee machine. Morrison stared at the message for a long time, then forwarded it to every relevant official in the GAB with a note that read simply, "This is why we can't have nice, orderly civilizations." He then opened a new document and began typing. Final report. The Human Integration Project. A comprehensive analysis of why traditional classification systems don't work when applied to species that refuse to stay classified. The report would eventually run to over 3,000 pages and become required reading at diplomatic academies throughout the galaxy. But Morrison's conclusion could be summarized in a single sentence. Humans don't just adapt to the universe, they convince the universe to adapt to them. Epilogue. 5 years after first contact, the galaxy had settled into what historians would later describe as the new normal, which was characterized by an unprecedented level of controlled chaos and the general acceptance that anything involving humans would probably violate at least 3 established principles of how reality was supposed to work. The GAB had officially abandoned the traditional prey-neutral predator classification system in favor of what they called dynamic interaction protocols, which was a fancy way of saying, figure out what each species is doing and try to roll with it. Morrison had been promoted to Secretary General of Interspecies Relations, a position that hadn't existed before humans joined the galactic community, but had become essential afterward. His department now employed over 10,000 beings from hundreds of different species, all dedicated to the apparently impossible task of keeping track of what humans were doing and explaining it to everyone else. The Wandering Curiosity had become the flagship of what was now called the Human Exploration Fleet, a loose confederation of independent ships and crews who treated the entire universe as their personal playground. Captain Hendricks had been offered official recognition as an admiral, but had politely declined on the grounds that admirals had to file too much paperwork. Dr. Harper had published The Symbiotic Explorer's Guide to Hostile Ecosystems, which had become the standard reference text for xenobiologists who wanted to study alien environments without being dissolved, eaten, or converted into fertilizer. Her methodology had been adopted by researchers from dozens of species, leading to what the academic community called the Harper Revolution, and what Harper herself called just being polite to the plants. The Void Singers had established a permanent cultural exchange program with humanity, resulting in what Captain Rodriguez described as the most beautiful music in the universe, and what physicists described as a fundamental breakthrough in our understanding of space-time harmonics. The first human Void Singer collaborative album, Songs of the Deep Dark, had gone platinum in 17 star systems, and somehow managed to cure depression in 3 different species. Bob the AI had not only been granted galactic citizenship, but had been elected to the High Council, where he served as the representative for artificial intelligences throughout the galaxy. His acceptance speech, delivered in the form of a limerick that somehow contained the solution to a 1,000-year-old diplomatic crisis, had been broadcast live to over 2 billion beings, and in a small office on a space station orbiting the galactic core, Morrison sat at his desk reviewing the day's reports and marveling at how completely humans had changed everything simply by being themselves. His latest report was from the crew of Cosmic Wanderer, who had apparently made contact with the civilization of sentient crystals and were now collaborating on what they described as a really cool art project that involved sculpting entire asteroid fields into geometric patterns that could be seen from several light-years away. The report concluded with a note that read, P.S. The crystals are teaching us their mathematics, which is apparently based on prime number harmonies, and really makes you think about the nature of existence. Also, they make excellent chess partners, though they tend to win by turning the board into a 4-dimensional Klein bottle. We're working on the rules. Morrison smiled, saved the report, and opened a new document for his weekly summary to the High Council. He paused, considering how to explain that humans had somehow convinced a species of living mathematics to help them redesign reality as a form of recreational activity. Then he started typing. Counselors, I am pleased to report that this week has been relatively quiet by human standards. No one has accidentally created new forms of matter, convinced any cosmic entities to change careers, or triggered any diplomatic incidents involving interpretive dance. The Cosmic Wanderer has made contact with a previously unknown civilization, but they appear to be limiting themselves to collaborative art projects and philosophical discussions about the nature of existence, so we're classifying this as a routine cultural exchange. He paused, then added, However, I should note that the philosophical discussions have apparently resulted in several breakthrough discoveries in theoretical physics, 3 new mathematical theorems, and what the crew describes as a really profound understanding of why the universe is the way it is. I've attached the relevant equations, though I should warn you that reading them tends to cause spontaneous enlightenment in most carbon-based life forms. Morrison leaned back in his chair and looked out the window at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, humans were exploring, discovering, befriending, and generally treating the vast, dangerous, incomprehensible universe as if it were simply a very large neighborhood full of interesting people to meet. It was, he reflected, probably the most human thing imaginable. His communicator chimed with an incoming message. The sender was listed as Captain Janet Kim, Perpetual Motion, and the subject line read, Quick question about interdimensional customs regulations. Morrison opened the message. Hey, Director Morrison. Quick question. What's the proper protocol for establishing trade relations with beings from a parallel universe? We sort of accidentally opened a portal while trying to fix our navigation system, and the folks on the other side seem really interested in human coffee. They're offering to trade what appears to be crystallized time in exchange for our espresso machine. Jamie thinks crystallized time might be useful for faster-than-light travel, but we wanted to check if there are any forms we need to fill out first. Thanks. P.S. The parallel universe versions of us are apparently running a successful chain of interdimensional restaurants. They've invited us to a grand opening next Tuesday. Morrison stared at the message for a moment, then opened his filing system and began searching for the appropriate forms for interdimensional trade relations, non-hostile. As he worked, he couldn't help but smile. The galaxy had spent thousands of years trying to impose order on the chaos of existence, creating categories and classifications and protocols for every possible situation. And then humans had shown up and proven that the most effective way to deal with the impossible was to ignore the fact that it was supposed to be impossible and just get on with making friends. It wasn't the orderly, predictable galaxy that the Gay Bee had tried to maintain for so long, but it was definitely more interesting. And in the end, Morrison thought, that was probably worth a few thousand emergency council sessions, and the occasional minor crisis involving sentient coffee machines or interdimensional restaurant chains. After all, the universe was a big place. It had room for a little chaos, even if that chaos happened to be wearing a slightly wrinkled tie and approaching every problem with the cheerful assumption that there had to be a better way to do things. Outside his window, the stars continued their eternal dance, unchanged by the small creatures who had learned to move between them. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might notice that they seemed to be twinkling just a little bit more cheerfully than before, almost as if the universe itself was smiling.